Welcome to our April webinar. This is GetPRDone. We're here with Laura, Ben, Alan Story and Nabila, who will tonight be discussing PR in Wales. Alan.
Okay, hi folks, I'm Alan Story from GetPRDone. I'm going to ask the three speakers, except only two of them are here right this minute, just to introduce themselves, who they are. So Laura, tell us about yourself.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, noswaith dda pawb. My name's Laura McAllister and I'm an academic at Cardiff University in the Wales Governance Centre. I work quite closely with the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, and I most recently and most relevant to this discussion, I chaired an expert panel on then Assembly reform, because we can come on to that, but the title of the institution changed quite recently, which looked at the issues of the size of the institution, the electoral system that should be used, should it be enlarged, and votes at 16. And I'm sure later on I'll tell you what our conclusions were on each of those areas.
Great. Ben.
Noswaith dda, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you. My name is Ben Lake. I'm the Plaid Cymru Member of Parliament, member of the Westminster Parliament for Ceredigion, and have been a Member of Parliament now coming up to 5 years. First elected in the 2017 general election.
Great. And as people may not know, Hefin is just doing his job. He's just voting right now. And so he'll be joining us in a few minutes. So the first question then for Laura and Ben is, what drew you to proportional representation? And what does it mean for Wales to have proportional representation in the Senedd? And we don't have that in England. So what's it mean to have PR in Wales? What, Laura?
Well, I think for me, it's very much tied in with the whole concept of a new Welsh democracy. If you go back to the late 1990s, when we held the second referendum on devolution, and by a pretty wafer-thin majority, the vote was in favour of creating what was then called a National Assembly for Wales. I think it was very clear that we needed to make that different in lots of important ways, from not only Westminster, but from local authorities too. And a really fundamental part of that difference was to ensure that it wasn't dominated by one party, that other parties had fair representation within the new parliamentary structures. So the model of electoral system that was employed right at the outset was a mixed member proportionality system called additional member system. I'm sure lots of people on the webinar this evening know about that, because this is your areas of expertise. But of course, there are very many variants of additional member system, and in many respects, the balance between the two parts of the ballot determine how much proportionality we're actually talking about. So I wouldn't go so far as to say we have a proportional electoral system in Wales. I'd say we have a semi-proportional electoral system in Wales using the hybrid model of AMS. Now, without jumping straight into all of the intricacies,
we're going to get to that in a few minutes.
We will get to it, but there's really one important point that listeners should know, which is the difference between the Scottish and the Welsh AMS systems. In Scotland, there is greater balance between the regional members and the first past the post constituency members. In Wales, it's 67-33. So ours is less proportional than the Scottish system. Hence, fast forward into recent times, we've had a quite stringent debate, I think, about altering that system, but that's tied in with increasing the size of the Senedd.
Right. Okay, Ben, what drew you to PR as a good model of governance?
I think simply put, I'm a very simple man, and I just felt, especially when I first started to campaign and knock doors, speaking to people about their intentions when it came to local and actually Senedd elections first time round, was just how many people were very apathetic about the whole thing. And I remember having several conversations with people saying, well, what's the point? Because I would like to vote for Party A, but only Party B gets in here and there's no point, my vote would be wasted, so I'm not going to waste my time to go to vote. And that really sort of struck a nerve with me, and I felt quite frightened actually about what that would mean for our democracy further down the line. You know, voter apathy is a big concern of mine and something that I think we should all be afraid of. And so logically then I came to the idea of, well, you know, how do we make sure that people feel as though it is worth going out to vote and to cast their ballot every time round? And PR then naturally lends itself, at least people then can, depending on, obviously we might talk about this, depending on the different types of PR system you want to employ, people can genuinely and truly actually feel as though their voices are counted, and even if it is perhaps their second or even third, fourth preference, at least they've had a chance to exert some influence over who is elected to represent them. So in a nutshell, that's really what drove me as a campaigner in PR, and then clearly once in Parliament that there are other reasons why I think we should be in favour of PR, but we'll get into that later, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, sometime we'll have PR for Westminster elections. That's down the road a bit. Now, what are any of the kind of concerns that have come up about PR as a voting system? Laura?
Well, there's no such thing as a perfect electoral system. I guess that's the first thing to say. And all of us who work in this area know that, because much of it is based on political cultures and history and knowledge that electors have, traditions even. And even if we stripped away all of that, it's very, very hard to engineer an electoral system that meets every single criteria. We did a quite forensic analysis of every electoral system as part of our expert panel work. We looked at majoritarian systems and proportional systems, and we tried to assess them against a series of principles. And they were the principles that everybody uses really when assessing electoral systems around proportionality, member accountability, voter choice, equivalent mandates, government accountability. And I think when you engage in that kind of exercise, you realize straight away that even if you were to create the kind of prototype perfect system, when you put it in place in a distinct nation like Wales, there's likely to be anomalies. So I think that's a really important consideration. You can criticize every electoral system, but nevertheless, in my opinion, there are some really important principles that you should follow. And I'm afraid that first past the post fails on almost all of those, in my opinion. And even our additional member system in Wales fails on too many of those for it to be regarded as a successful and democratic and invigorating electoral system.
Right. Ben, any sort of weaknesses that you see in PR as a system?
Sorry, Alan, I might dive in just a second. I was going to say, what are the concerns that have been raised around PR? Not only sort of your own, also what colleagues and in terms of constituents, recognizing that people won't all have the same concerns. I'm curious what your experience is there.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I suppose the usual concerns that are perhaps raised by elected MPs, you've probably heard them, and I don't think they really hold much water, but you know, it is something that I often hear from those who are hesitant or even opposed to moving away from first past the post, and that is, you know, first past the post delivers you a decisive kind of executive and government. Now, I think there's a point we could argue that, you know, in terms of is decisiveness actually achieved? I mean, we need only look at the 2017-2019 Parliament, but also whether it is actually something that a voting system should try to achieve in itself. I mean, I would argue that more important is a representative government and policies that offer the best sort of solution that represents as wide a range as possible of the electorate, or the citizens, sorry, of the country. But that is something that you often hear from MPs who are very, very concerned about PR. Another one then, and again, I don't agree with this concern. They and sometimes I get this from English MPs more than I do Welsh MPs. They say that it's too complicated, and that you know, people won't be able to understand how to go to vote. And you know, if we were starting to have any sort of PR, they'll reach the polling booth, they'll see the ballot paper, they'll get scared and they won't vote. Now that is ludicrous. You need only look at all the countries in the world that have PR systems to just show that that isn't the case. And indeed, in Wales, we have an experience, albeit it's AV, but the last few rounds of the Senedd elections in 2017, sorry, this last year rather, it coincided with the Police and Crime Commissioner elections, in which you had an alternative vote, and people did, the sky didn't fall in. People still went out to vote, still casted their ballots without much problem. So those are the kind of common sort of concerns that are put to you by those who are opposed to PR. And in my opinion, as I say, they don't really hold much scrutiny. And I think they're just the kind of usual old-fashioned tropes to try and throw back at people. And what I tend to say then is that, look, nothing is perfect, but if you're telling me that first past the post, its major benefit is that it delivers you decisive sort of government, then I'm sorry, it fails on that metric.
Right. And this one last question before we get to the one-on-ones. There's an awful lot of lack of trust of politicians in this country, not surprisingly. And what role can PR, a lot of people just, the level of support sort of for political institutions is like at a pretty rock bottom level. What role can PR movements and people who believe in PR do to sort of encourage the disenfranchised, the disengaged to get involved?
Also the councillors and MPs too here.
Yeah. Laura.
Well, I think we've got to be a bit cautious about not promising too much from changing the electoral system alone. And certainly that's the case in Wales. I think we were fortunate in framing our debate about renewing democracy in Wales around other areas of enriching our democracy too. So, for example, the Senedd has introduced votes at 16. So last year's Senedd elections were the first that young people aged 16 and 17 and foreign nationals living in Wales are able to vote in Senedd and local elections. So next week's elections, voters aged 16 and 17 will also be able to cast their vote. And for us as well, and this is culturally specific but important as well, the debate on electoral reform has tended to be tied in with a very significant argument for increasing the size of our parliament. We were I'm trying to think of the best and politest way of putting this, but the Senedd size has been an issue since it was first established because it's been far too small and underpowered and lacking in capacity to scrutinise government. It only has 60 MSs, which means that once you take out ministers and people with official roles like the Llywydd, the presiding officer, and the deputy Llywydd, it means you're left with about 44 backbenchers. Now, if you look at the competencies that the Senedd has over really important areas like the health service, education, transport, economic development, and then you expect a group of around 40 backbenchers, in effect, to operate the committee system and scrutinise government effectively, it's pretty apparent that that can't happen. And good scrutiny is sadly lacking in big parts of the Senedd's work, in my opinion, and I think many people would agree with that. So therefore, and this is relevant to the conversation, we've had a very trenchant debate about increasing the size of the Senedd to between 80 and 100 members. And that would, of course, require change to the electoral system. Now, that can be an asset or a disadvantage, depending on which way you want to see it. But for me, it gives a chance to actually look at ripping up the model of the hybrid model of PR we have at the moment and having something a bit more muscular and a bit more proportional and a bit more representative of how people cast their votes. Right.
Okay. And Ben, why don't you jump in and then I'm going to go back to Laura.
Yeah, I agree with, well, you'll be unsurprised to say I agree with Laura. And I think in terms of what a PR system could do, and we shouldn't overstate the the immediate sort of benefits that will come about from electoral reform. You know, it will take time, as you know, as you'll be aware. You know, party systems, the nature of electoral competition will change and respond in time. So it won't be immediate, but it'll be something that changes gradually. But it'll bring about a different culture to decision making and parliamentary politics. I just think at the moment you have a situation in Westminster. Let's use it as the extreme example here. You have both a first past the post majoritarian system that delivers disproportionate majority for the governing party, sometimes on quite a meager share of the popular vote, meaning that they can disregard the views of other parties in the parliament. We're seeing that to an extent at the moment in Westminster. It's unsurprising then that you have a large section of the population, what is it at the moment, some 60% of the population didn't vote for the Conservative Party, disillusioned that not only are they getting Conservative government, but also quite a pure kind of unrestrained form of Conservative politics. Now, agree or disagree with Conservative policies, the fact of the matter remains, you have a policy agenda that can be pursued without much restraint or influence by opposition voices, solely due to the electoral system. And if you were to bring in a proportional representative system, what you would have is a significantly changed political culture in which consensual politics, in my opinion, will start to emerge. Compromise will no longer be a dirty word or a sign of weakness, but actually an objective of good policy making. And that's what PR can do. It's not easy to crystallize and sell that on the doorstep in a very short conversation. I do concede that, but it is nevertheless one of the big prizes, in my opinion, of PR. Okay,
Hefin has just done his duty and voted. So Hefin, I'm just going to bring you in
Alan,
for a second. Perfect timing. Perfect
Alan,
timing.
I was just going to say to Ben, I don't think it's what you've said about these issues whereby the question about what are the concerns you feel around PR, what are the concerns of colleagues, of constituents, of the electorate, and the same thing applies. You said about how there's quite a lot of objections and barriers that once you actually scrutinize them, there's not a whole lot there. And this is something that's also, I think, what's the case here, isn't it, in terms of if we can't do it on the doorstep. Actually, you can get pretty much damn anything on the doorstep if you do it well and if you really prioritize it. And if you don't, you sure as hell aren't.
Okay. So, Hefin, why don't you just tell us briefly why you like PR as a voting system and what do you think might be the problems with it?
Well, we got.
And why don't you introduce yourself first, actually, just so that.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. My name's Hefin David, member of the Senedd for Caerphilly. I'm Welsh Labour member, elected as the directly constituency elected. So we've got a funny system where you've got it's the DeHont system. So you've got the constituency and also the list, which is the region. So we've got 4 regional members. I'm the constituency member. So it's kind of first past the post. So the DeHont system is not entirely proportional. What brought me to PR, my favourite system is STV. What brought me to PR is we had 40% of the vote in Caerphilly, in Wales, in the Senedd election, Welsh Labour, 40% of the vote. But we had 50% of the seats. And Ben will tell you that's not fair. I agree with Ben on that one. I liked what I just came in as he was talking about consensus politics. And incidentally, I'd like to see a bigger Senedd with 100 members rather than 60. I would have liked to have seen a coalition government with Labour and Plaid Cymru this time around too, which would have reflected more than 50% of the electorate. At the moment, the government you've got represents 40% of those who voted. I just don't think that's right. Not that I'm going to ask Welsh Labour to get out of the government. It's the system we've got. But I would have liked to have seen a coalition. There's a confidence and supply agreement with Plaid Cymru at the moment. I would like to have seen a full coalition. And I think really PR brings about that kind of enforced consensus and agreement. And that's why I've come to PR as an option.
Right. Okay. I think I'm just going to jump the order of questions and ask Laura in, 3-4 minutes to describe to us exactly how the election system works in Wales, so we've all got the same kind of factual basis to then start discussing. Some parts are first past the post, some aren't. If you could just give us a little lecture, 3 minutes or so on that.
Okay, I'll do my best. I'll keep it really simple. Okay, so we've got 60 MSs at the moment. 40 of them, like Hefin, are elected directly for 40 constituencies through a first past the post system. Then the other 20 are elected through the proportional part of the system, which is a list, a closed list. And we have 5 electoral regions. A little bit of an anomaly because those go back to the European election regions, and of course we have no MEPs any longer. But nevertheless, we persist with those 5 regions, and they elect 4 MSs. And the counting system, as Hefin described, is the detriment system, which I'm sure lots of people on the call will understand. It's less proportional than using San Lagu, the other counting system, but that was the one that was chosen. So in total, we have 60, and every region would have a number of constituency MSs and a number of regional MSs. So there's different mandates because there are different routes for each of those politicians to come into the Senedd. And against our test, which I mentioned earlier, against some of the principles of electoral systems, the whole issue of equivalent mandate comes to the fore. I'm afraid the additional member system doesn't provide equivalent mandate, however much the Senedd tries to treat every MS in a similar and a similarly respectful fashion. And I think that's it in a nutshell. The important thing to mention again is the distinction between Scotland and Wales, which also uses an AMS system. The Scottish system is more proportional because they have more regional members than we have, basically. How's that?
Sure, thank you. 3 minutes, great. Now, there's the question, of course, to be raised from that is 40-20. What happens if it went to 40-40? What forces, say, then you have 80 members, 40 would be elected by first past the post, and 40 by a somewhat proportional system. Who would be opposed to that in Wales? Okay, okay.
I would be opposed to that. The reason I'd be opposed to it is at the moment, Laura said, the idea is every member is treated equally. But every member is not, I agree, they are treated equally, but every member is not the same. So I've got a constituency to represent, which is 62,000 electors, and two of the Conservatives and 2 of the Labour Plaid Cymru members who are in my constituency also represent the whole of South East Wales. Now that's just not fair, both not fair on workload. Not that they get more workload. I think the case where it comes to the constituency member because they're used to the Westminster parliamentary system, but it's not fair that they notionally have this different area, range of areas to represent. I don't think you should have 2 different kinds of members. I think you should have one kind of member who's elected in a common way, and the common way I would say is STV. I think it works in Ireland. Professor McAllister, I should say, Professor McAllister, has written a brilliant report called A Parliament That Works for Wales, and she's done all the legwork on this. It's been done. She's got the recommendations there, and I'm backing 100% on achieving that.
What is the kind of system that you would like to see then, Laura? I said 40-40, 40 first past the post. I wouldn't be in favor of that. I was just trying to change the yardsticks. What would you think, if you became, king for the day, queen for the day in Wales, we're changing the voting system, what would it be to?
Okay, well, Hefin very kindly alluded to our report, A Parliament That Works for Wales, which came out in 2017. And what we tried to do there was evaluate the different potential electoral systems, including your one, Alan, of increasing the size of the Senedd to 80 and using 40 regional members and 40 first past the post. The problem with that is the one that Hefin has alluded to. You still don't address this issue of equivalent mandate. And it fails on a number of other fronts as well in terms of proportionality and constituency boundaries and so on. So what we came out with in our report was our favoured system of STV in a Senedd of between 80 and 90 members. I know there's a debate to be had about enlarging it further than that, but that was the feeling we had about being able to justify and rationalise the case for increasing the size. And we looked at 2 different models of constituencies, and I don't want to get too technical or too local here, because I appreciate your audience is bigger than that, but we felt it was important to map the constituencies on Welsh constituencies, that is Senedd constituencies or local authority constituencies, rather than Westminster House of Commons boundaries, because it seemed anomalous to us to change your electoral system and then tie them into another institution's system, which is always going to be subject to organic change. So we called for STV as our favoured system. We also called for gender quotas to be built into STV, relatively easily, by the way, to build in gender quotas. However, in our report, we made it clear that if gender quotas were not agreed by the parties, then we would also favour a flexible list system. And I'm sure you're aware of how that works. Most European countries use flexible list currently, which gives, some degree, depending on how you introduce a threshold for candidates and so on, gives a bit more power to voters to choose which candidate they want, but greater proportionality in terms of how they cast their vote for the main parties that are standing. Our third option was the status quo option, which was tweaking the additional member system in the way you've mentioned, Alan, 40-40. But we made it pretty clear that that should only be done as a worst case scenario in terms of change, for the reasons that Hefin has mentioned and the reasons that I've mentioned. So STV was overwhelmingly our favoured option.
I wasn't really advocating that. I was trying to see, like, where's, I mean, I would quite frankly be much in favor of a fully proportional system. Who are the forces against that?
Well, I'm sure Hefin will want to come in here as well. I mean, in fairness, I think there's been a pretty healthy debate around PR and Senedd reform in Wales, particularly including Welsh Labour, Plaid Cymru, and the single Welsh Lib Dem, and some Conservatives. I think we need to be fair. Some of the Welsh Conservative group in the Senedd are supportive individually of Senedd reform. However, the party and its leadership speaks out pretty regularly against increasing the size of the Senedd and against changing the electoral system. So 3 of the 4 parties that are currently represented in the Senedd do favour reform. The problem, as always, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, is that the parties have to keep one eye on their own electoral interest. It would be odd if they had no regard for how an electoral system would benefit them in terms of their geographical support. But I think as well, in fairness to Welsh Labour particularly, the party's also been able to park some of that and have a more objective and nuanced conversation about different electoral systems. And I think it deserves credit for doing that.
Right.
Just in response to that, Laura said you might want to comment, and just in response to that issue, who's against it? Well, the Conservative Party is called the Conservative Party for a reason. Their existence is to conserve the status quo and to conserve the way things are. Certainly pre-Thatcher, that was what they did. And I think there's a certain degree of that happening. Things are working, why change it? Some of the more thoughtful members, David Melding was a member who was there for many years and was perhaps less like that, but unfortunately a lot of the more thoughtful members have left the chamber. Susie Davis is another Conservative who's left, Laura, we'd remember. And they've been replaced by people who are less likely to agree to change. Although one you need to keep an eye on is a guy called Sam Kurtz, who's the member of the Senedd for, I forget his constituency, but Conservative member of the Senedd. And he is got into trouble the other day because we did a BBC Wales broadcast, and he said that he would that it's necessary to move in the way that we are talking about today. He then hastily had to tweet something that retracted that because the chief whip had a bit of a word. But there are forces within the Conservative group that are in favour of reform. But I think the problem is that Westminster, the Tories benefit from first past the post, and I think that is the big drag on the Tories in Wales from making a change, is because they are really dominated by the Westminster Party and wouldn't like to speak out in a way that would detract from the Westminster Party line.
Right. I'll just maybe ask, we're sort of jumping around here. What has been the response Laura.
You answered this a bit already.
Just a second, Nabila, just a minute now. I'm just going to go over to you and Ben in a second here. What has been the response from the government to your report, which recommended, just want you to run through it quickly again.
Okay, just very quickly. I mean, I think the response has been measured and sound in that when our report came out, it was, I think, reasonably well received by most of the political parties. A special committee was then established in the Senedd, chaired by a Labour MS, one of Hefin's colleagues, Dawn Bowden, who came up with pretty similar, I think Ben and Hefin would agree, pretty similar recommendations to the ones we came up with. Unfortunately, we then hit the Senedd elections in 2021, so there wasn't time in any case to legislate in that period. But since the Senedd elections, and particularly since the cooperation agreement between Ben and Hefin's parties, Plaid and Welsh Labour, there's been a special purposes committee established, which has representation of all the parties in the Senedd, which is looking at creating some agreement over the basis of a piece of legislation that will change the size and the electoral system. Now, I'm not underestimating how difficult it is to achieve consensus on that for fairly obvious reasons. I mean, I think it was either Ben or Hefin mentioned Labour's success in winning half the seats with a third of the vote. It's actually, if you look back to the 2016 election, it's a bit worse, if anything, Hefin, because I think Labour won 33% of the vote odd and had nearly half of the seats.
Well,
so in fairness,
40% of the vote. That's right.
Yeah, exactly. And in fairness to Welsh Labour, you could easily make the case, as was alluded to a moment ago with the Conservatives, that why would you change something that benefits you? But I think the agreement with Plaid Cymru has allowed Labour to rehearse some of the more democratic arguments for changing electoral system and for revitalising the democracy we have. Because at the end of the day, we still have not managed to generate a turnout of over 50% in a national election for the Senedd in Wales. And that's pretty dreadful. So we need to do something to revitalise our democracy. And I think changing the electoral system is an important part of that.
Right. I'll just ask you, one of the things that's being proposed by the Conservative government in Westminster is that, in fact, we change the boundaries for Westminster elections. And this is seen, in their view, as a way to make the elections fairer, is by, in fact, having all the single member plurality constituencies all have about the same number of votes, and then it'll be all fair, right? Well, no. How is this going over in Wales? Because what I saw was that Wales is going to lose, I saw 8 seats in Westminster as a result of this Conservative-led boundary commission.
Well, I'm not sure where to start with that, really, because, I think that the narrative that the Conservatives are championing is probably a long way away from the truth of why the boundary changes are coming in. This is about equalisation of populations rather than anything else. And clearly there is a degree of party advantage in this. I'm not sure that I would buy the case that this does much to revitalise a pretty stale democracy in the House of Commons. Clearly, Wales will lose out in the number of MPs we send from Wales to Westminster. As you rightly say, we would probably go down, because the proposals are under consultation at the moment, we would probably go down from 40 to 32. That's a big chunk down. But of course, if you're basing it purely on population size, that is in line with equalisation. But equalisation of population size doesn't take into account demographics, rurality, some of the important points that I know Ben would want to emphasise, coming from a constituency like Ceredigion, huge landmass, very rural, distinctive language, culture as well. So I mean, it's a narrative that I don't necessarily buy, and I think there are far more important things that could be done to revitalise the staleness of Westminster rather than boundary commission changes. That would be very low down on my list of things that will have most impact, I have to say.
Right.
Just very briefly, I sat on the bill committee for the Boundaries Bill, well, Boundaries Act now actually, which brought about the new sort of universal electoral quota that in real terms means that Wales will lose the number of MPs it sends to Westminster. And the other thing I would add to what Laura said is just perhaps to emphasise, and it's something that we debated in committee, but sadly it never made the Commons and it didn't influence the government. But the debate we had in committee was the nature of representation. Clearly there is one way of measuring it in that, one vote equals, that every vote is equal to each other regardless of where you are in the UK, that equalisation argument. And it's a valid one, right? I'm not denying that. But in representation, especially in a parliamentary system, and in a first past the post electoral system,
right?
Actually, you don't need to think of other ways or other dimensions of what is representative. And in a first past the post system, or at least some of its more proponents would argue, you have that direct link with your representative. It's easy to hold them to account. It's easy to turn to them for help, and that's actually where the changes to the boundaries and the effect that it has in many rural areas of the UK. The seat that I currently represent would probably, again, we don't know for certain, but probably would enlarge in such a way that, geographically speaking, from one end to the other, from the northernmost village to the southernmost village or community, would be over 100 miles. Now, in practical terms, some of the proponents of first past the post are also the proponents of face-to-face surgeries, that the MP going around to events, being seen in the community, easy to be accessed. Well, I can tell you one thing: whoever represents some of these new seats will have their job cut out. And I don't necessarily think that the benefit of equalisation of the value of votes will be matched by will be worth the inevitable hit that those new representatives, in terms of the quality of those new representatives, because they will not be able to deliver the same type of service that people have understandably grown to expect.
So we've got a question about Westminster, but what do we need to be doing and thinking about to deliver it here, do you think? And I don't expect you to give a long answer on this, because this is about Wales too,
Yeah, of course.
What do we need to think about?
Of course. If I can be very blunt, a change of government would help. There are some thoughtful Conservative members of Parliament, but they're very much in a minority, and even more so now after the 2019 election. So that's my sort of partisan answer of the way. You need a change of government. To be a little bit more kind of balanced, I do recognise that there is an implicit kind of incentive for any government that has won on a particular system to perhaps stick with that system out of the belief that that is in their electoral interest, right? And that's not a partisan point to make. Political parties ultimately are there to, well, I suppose there's a different argument that we could be having about what is the purpose of political parties, but most political parties would see it as one of their main purposes is to win office. And so if they win on a particular electoral system, they tend to want to stick to it. And it's very hard when they're in office to perhaps to enact some of the changes that they would want to see happen when they're in opposition. But in terms of what should be done, I think what you're doing in terms of these discussions and sort of civic society campaigns are very important. There is a growing body of cross-party MPs in Parliament who are committed to PR and electoral reform. It has been a difficult few years, actually, due to other constitutional debates, for the debate on electoral reform to really get the sort of attention it deserves on the parliamentary agenda. But it's lobbying individual MPs to get them to attend some of the cross-party group meetings on PR. That's probably the, in the here and now, what individual citizens could do. Try to engage with their MP to ensure that, if they're a member of a party that is open to PR, get them active in trying to make those changes. If they're not part of a party that is in favour of PR, at least engage with them to try and soften them. Because the more Conservative MPs that are at least open to it, the better. But to come back to my very short initial response, ultimately you need to change your government, because I can't see electoral reform ever being part of a solely Conservative-led government.
Right, thank you. So next thing I was going to ask, you've kind of covered it a bit on terms of why people might be hesitant to support PR, but on Labour particularly, does it matter that there isn't a widespread open position and support on it? Although there are groups, it's not a, you know, and it helped deliver PR for Wales and Scotland. It's not a position, open position. Does that hesitance matter here?
I think perhaps Hefin would be better placed to give you a decent answer than I. But what I would say, just my reflections, I'm a member of a lot of the two of the groups that push for PR at Westminster, the cross-party groups. And I think it's fair to say that some of the most ardent members have been Labour politicians. I remember my first Parliament being told by Gwynfor Jones, who's a Liberal and a Labour member, how important it was that the Labour Party would fully commit to a position on PR. So I think it would be helpful, yes, but don't discount the fact that a lot of the leading voices, to their credit, are Labour members. So I suppose it would be good in that you could then check off, right, all of these parties support it, and these are the parties that do not. So in terms of simplicity, then yes, it would be useful.
But a vote statement just saying that we are a PR party isn't necessarily needed to get it done, and that doesn't reflect whether they would support it when it came to time, does it?
Well, I think, if we were to, it would probably need to be part of an election manifesto for it to be prominent part of any Labour government programme for government. I think in that sense, that sort of statement would be necessary. But again, Hefin would be surprised to hear me say, but to their credit, a lot of the leading members of the cross-party campaigns in Westminster are Labour members. So yes, to be very, very short answer, if the leadership were able to commit, yes, of course, I'd back that, I'd support that, it would be helpful, and recognising in order to get it through in any sort of programme for government, you probably need it to be a part of the manifesto in the previous election.
Great, thank you. So another question. So having won an election in 2017 on just over 29% of the vote and having benefited from this past the post, some may be somewhat surprised you support PR. Did that not put you off? Because like you say, the parties that benefit, why would they?
No. And see, because I kind of consider my experiences and the fact that I was elected on 29% of the vote as almost self-explanatory that I want PR, because the first 2 years of my elected life, my kind of authority, if you like, or my credibility was constantly undermined. It didn't matter how good my arguments were, how hard I worked, people just dismissed me completely because I wasn't a proper MP, because I only got in on 29% of the vote. So, I backed myself that if it was a PR system, I'd like to think I'd get in anyway. So that, that's why I'm, but I was in favour of PR anyway, but, it's another reason why I'm in favour of reform, is because it does, and perhaps it's an important point to convey, actually. It helps the individual representative, whether it's a member of the Senedd or member of the Westminster Parliament, to be constantly undermined because of the share of the vote that you received. It does have an impact. So in terms of ensuring that the individual representative is firing on all cylinders and doing the best job they can do, if they have that knowledge that they were elected fairly and with a proper mandate, that a PR system would deliver them, it's a win-win, and it's certainly actually in the interest, I argue, of members of Parliament who are, I'm only now elected on some 39% or 38% of the vote, so I'm still, in a minority. But if I was elected on a PR system, I wouldn't have to answer all questions about my credibility. They then just judge me on my performance.
I'm sure we could find other questions.
Yeah.
Other ways to scrutinize. There's more than one way. Okay, so this one is, I don't know, maybe we'll leave to end, but how should supporters of PR vote in local elections? What influence can they have there? What do we need to be doing?
You know, there is clearly, local elections will be contested on a whole range of issues relating to, council services and the functions of a local councillor, and I think that's inevitable. But if somebody actually considers that their priority for a representative is somebody who would be a proponent for PR and electoral change, then let's not discount the fact that, taken as a collective, county councillors across Wales are a very, very important part of our governance, and through the council leaders themselves and the Welsh Local Government Association, they're a very powerful voice, an important voice in the way policies are made in Wales. So, it's worth people, if they feel strongly that it is their priority, grilling the candidates effectively. What are their views on the electoral system? Would they support PR? Are they supporting a particular type of PR? Because we need, and this is a more general point, but I think it is relevant for local council elections. If we hope to really win this campaign, there is going to need to be a vast improvement in the quality of public discourse. Well, I can speak for in Wales. I can't really speak with any authority for England, but certainly in Wales, we do need to heighten the bar and the level of our popular debate, especially when it comes to the constitutional issues, electoral reform being an important part of it. So by forcing county councillors to talk about it, you then ensure that they are aware of it. I'm sure they would be anyway, but you ensure that there is that discussion, and you're very likely then to actually, in a hustings or a similar sort of event, have that expose the arguments to people who perhaps haven't been aware of them beforehand. That in itself, and it's a very gradualist approach, and a long-term approach of building that coalition. But I'm a firm believer actually that if these changes are to be sustainable and effective, then actually you do have to do the legwork, and it's not something that can happen always, in a single event or overnight. It's something that entails a lot of work, and we're very lucky in Wales to have Professor McAllister and the Wales Governance Centre actually, because a lot of the sort of academic kind of studies are there for us. It's just now over to the politicians, whether it be they community councillors, local councillors, members of the Westminster Parliament, or members of the Senedd, to get it done.
Now that Wales can change its voting systems for the local elections and Senedd, what barriers are there for Wales to send representation to Westminster?
I'm not sure I can understand the question. So in terms of the barriers of
having representation in Westminster, maybe thinking on the Scottish situation, English votes for the influence element too, because some of that does end up affecting.
No, of course, and that's something that has certainly been the case in my time anyway in elected politics, that it is sometimes the different roles of different tiers of government is not always well understood, and I don't blame the Welsh public completely for this. We have a role as political parties and as representatives to try and explain the different functions, whether that be Westminster, Senedd, or indeed local authorities. But in terms of the representation, Wales's representation in Westminster, I suppose it's under threat insofar as there will be fewer MPs after the next general election, unless the general election comes before, I think it's September 2023. It'll be on the new electoral law, which would see 32 seats from Wales rather than 40. So in that sense, quite literally, Wales's voice or Wales's representation will be diminished, and I think that's a barrier then to ensure. Well, it's a greater hindrance to getting Welsh matters and Welsh-only concerns to be addressed in Parliament. The other thing I would also say, of course, is that the electoral system, first past the post, given that it's a majoritarian system, always runs the risk of certain parts of the country being completely locked out of government and influencing government. Some of the old stages in Westminster used to say that we have to keep the archaic way of voting, where we are divided physically into two lobbies, because it's a good way for backbenchers to lobby and have one-to-one time with government ministers away from the civil servants. Well, that's rubbish if you're not voting with the government, right? And then when you do then have a situation, if you consider the results of the last general election, yes, the Conservatives have members of Parliament from Scotland and Wales, but they're very much in a minority. So they're the only ones that can then actually form a government under the Westminster system when there is a majority for one party. So you have a situation whereby for Scotland, the Scottish Secretary, I mean, if the current member, if the current Scottish Secretary were to stand down for whatever reason, I think they'd run out. I don't think they have another candidate, because the other Scottish Conservative has already been there and stood down as well. So then they'd be looking at, you know, a Conservative member from England. And I think it was certainly the case in the first Blair era that they did have to have a Welsh Secretary who wasn't representing a seat in Wales, because they had no Tories in Wales. The point I'm trying to make in a very rambling way is that a big barrier to Wales's representation in Westminster actually arises from the fact that we have a majoritarian system. It's not as bad, I concede, it's not as bad if Labour are in government, clearly, because until now, Labour have been very well represented in Wales. But that's not a good enough excuse, in my opinion, to keep the electoral system, because you then have these massive periods in between, or a cycle, where Wales is completely disenfranchised when it comes to government positions, or effectively disenfranchised when it comes to government ministers.
I'm going to jump here and suggest that we pass on the questions to Ben and we go to Hefin now, because I know then Laura also has to leave fairly shortly. Do you have any final things you want to say, Laura?
No, I think thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed the debate with Hefin and Ben as well. I'm afraid you've got three people who are pretty much of one mind on this, so we don't want to give the impression that all of Wales is united behind STV and a larger Senedd. Would that were the case, of course, but no, I think, you know, I would, if people are interested, I would ask them to look at our report, A Parliament That Works for Wales, because there's a lot of material in there, and we've even done modelling based on previous election results to show how, for example, the Gallagher index of proportionality would work, and how de Hont and San-Legu would work differently. But you know, it's not for the faint-hearted. It's quite technical, but you know, if people are interested, then you can download a copy from the Senedd website as well. So thank you for having me. Is the final thing I'll say, and apologies for having to leave early.
No, Hefin, we're really interested in, like, there's our group mostly works at trying to win over, you know, Westminster to PR. I mean, that's our main priority. In that sort of struggle, and we've put a lot of emphasis on the Labour Party, because we do think that when a situation where two big parties are supporting first past the post and all the others don't, we can't go anywhere until we win over Labour. And a lot has occurred in the last year to do that. Right. Okay, so what's Welsh Labour thinking about getting PR for the Labour parties, you know, the British, you know, the British Labour Party, winning the British Labour Party to PR?
So the difficult thing is Welsh Labour is almost a separate entity to UK Labour. Keir Starmer's attended one of our group meetings. You've got a leader in Wales, Mark Drakeford, who is absolutely committed to PR. He believes in it. The First Minister of Wales believes in PR. There's no question about that. And I think that. The problem is, I don't think Keir Starmer is quite as convinced. I don't think it's something that's at the top of his agenda, really. But I did have the chance to put it directly to him when he attended our group meeting about two months ago, the Senedd Labour Party meeting.
Oh, tell us. This is very interesting to us.
Yeah, he came to he comes about once a year, really. Should come more often, but he comes about once a year. One of the two things I said to him. Well, number one, you've got the greatest, most successful electoral Labour machine in the world in Wales. You need to learn some lessons from it. But the other thing is, I think he's going to be Prime Minister. I think he's got a very good chance of being Prime Minister, but it will be in a coalition. I think the SNP and Liberal Democrats and Plaid Cymru will need to be on board with it. And I think that's his chance to reshape democracy in our country by introducing single transferable vote PR. I would love to see a form of PR being introduced by the Labour leader, and I said that to him. His response to me, and this is...
Oh, yes, let's listen to this. We've been trying to figure out someone who's talked to him about PR for 2 years. Spill it.
Well, he was sitting like this, right? He was sitting like this when he was answering me. So I don't know whether the body language means anything, but it's not typical body language of Keir Starmer. He said to me that he's really interested in my view. He's really interested in the fact that the Welsh Labour support it. And he's asked Gordon Brown to engage in a constitutional commission. And what he suggests we do is we feed our views directly to Gordon. Now, the question is Gordon going to feed back to him that PR is the way forward for Labour? So I suspect if we want to influence Keir Starmer, the way to do it is to try and influence Gordon Brown in reporting back. Interestingly, Sarah Brown, his wife, has just started following me on Twitter. So I don't know whether that means anything or not, but I'm certainly going to try my best to try and influence her that way. But I think Keir Starmer is keen to not get too closely involved in the debate at this point in time. I don't know why. I think it's probably because the party itself is divided at the UK level. Ben said something very interesting earlier. If you're going to do it, it needs to be in a manifesto. The last thing you want is to do this through a referendum. You don't want to have a referendum on this. You need to have it in the manifesto before the election and just do it. I really don't believe in these referendums at all. I think they really don't. If you've got a good representative democracy, you don't need referendums all the time. And I think, if you can get it into the manifesto before the next election, then you're on a winner. I think we're on a knife edge. I think it's possible it could still happen. The trade unions are surreptitiously opposed to it, although publicly they say that they're in favor of the most representative democracy possible. Actually, I think they're a bit of a block on it. And I think, if we're going to do it, we need to get the UK Labour majority on board. So the lesson I've learned from Wales is how did we get PR into the electoral system for the Senedd in 1999? How do we do it? Well, there's a political hero of mine who I'm lucky enough to know personally called Ron Davies. Now, the country at large knows him for taking a walk on Clapham Common in 1997 and being robbed at knife point and having various personal difficulties. But he was instrumental in the establishment of the what was then called the National Assembly for Wales. And his approach was to do what me and Ben like to do, is have dialogue with other political parties, keep Liberal Democrats Plaid on board, and he brought in this proportional system. He walked over hot coals to achieve it, but he was a visionary leader who achieved it. Now, we've got that in Mark Drakeford in Wales, but then what we haven't got is a big figure in UK Labour pushing it. If we could have a big figure in UK Labour, I think it would make the world of difference. So that's where the challenge lies, really. Yeah. And there's people like me and Ben, who, with the best will in the world, Ben, there are more senior people in our parties, who believe in it.
That really is the problem, is that the leading the best known person is John McDonnell. But John is not on the inside. You see, the trouble is that Rachel Reeves, Shadow Chancellor, against PR, Yvette Cooper against PR, Starmer is not out. I mean, I
don't think Starmer is anti-PR. I just think it's a battle he doesn't fancy having. He's got other things he needs to do.
He's not a man who wants to take risks. And have his big idea of, hey, this would be a big idea in this whole country to, in fact, get PR. It would enliven the whole political debate in the country. But anyways, let's just go to the local level now. You just described now that local councils in Wales, if they decide, can, in fact, have their local elections on PR.
Yeah, no.
How's that going? What's the debate around that been?
Okay, so this is where I probably will divert from the views of the majority in this group at this point in time, because I'm not actually in favor of PR for local authorities. There's a number of reasons for that. And one of the reasons is the incredibly low turnout. We have a 25% turnout, which I don't think lends itself. But also, I think we got multi-member wards, and it gives the opportunity to the low turnout and the multi-member wards on a small geographical basis gives the opportunity to talented independents and even talented party candidates to make that ward their own. My dad was stood as an independent in 2004 and won the seat at the top of the poll. And the reason was because he was a talented politician who knew how to get popular in his ward. So I'm not in favor. I'm sorry if I'm upsetting people, but I'm not in favor of PR for local government. But I do believe in compulsory multi-member wards. The other thing, of course, you don't get all the parties standing because you can't find the candidates to stand. So usually it's Labour v Plaid or Labour v Independent or Plaid v Independent. You tend not to see a proper choice for the electors because you simply cannot find the candidates to stand. So I don't think PR kind of works in that environment. With regards to the options, it is in the law. If a majority on the council, I think it may be a 2/3 majority, I'll have to check that. If a 2/3 majority, I think, decide they want their next election to be based on proportional representation, then they can do that. It's up to them. A bit of news for you, in Caerphilly, neither the Labour Party nor Plaid Cymru are in favour of doing that because I think perhaps they fear it might not be in their interest to do so. So there is no majority whatsoever for it, and nor would the independents support it either.
How many councils, elections, either upcoming or a year from now, are likely to be like? What percentage will be? None. There's not been any councils who supported this idea.
No.
So Labour, in the Labour government in Wales, decided to give this option to local councils.
Do you know why it was an option?
Yeah, I want to know that. Yeah.
Nobody wanted it. So they knew that if they try and enforce it, there'd be a revolution.
No, right.
And so they said you can do as an option then instead. Nobody wanted it. Local government reform is a minefield in Wales. There are 22 local authorities. There's too many of them. We need to reform it, but actually we're all agreed we need reform, but the actual nature of the outcome we can't agree on. So I think, do you know what? I think if Wales is going to be an example, I wouldn't take local authorities as the example. I take the Senedd. Now, the Senedd is in a different, I'm about to say, the Senedd is an entirely different kind of democracy, entire kind of parliament to that in Westminster. I was about to say that, and then I realized that on my Twitter, top of my Twitter today is me having a ding-dong with Plaid Cymru.
That's all right. That's all right.
In the context of the local elections, but that isn't typical of how the Senedd works. Right. We have much more consensual politics, even with the Conservatives as well. It's a better environment. We had UKIP in there last time, and even then, it wasn't that hostile an environment that it would have otherwise been in Westminster. And I think part of it is down to the fact we are almost proportional, but we still got a way to go. And I'm confident that Plaid and Labour together will achieve that. The race is on for 2026, though. I'm worried that the timescale is very tight to achieve it by 2026. They should have started a year ago. And by the way, I stood for Deputy Presiding Officer last year, the Deputy Speaker role. My intention would have been to get it underway straight away. I didn't get it. I lost it by 34 votes to 26, something like that. Ben, your Plaid group didn't support me. That's where it went wrong. But I wanted to get it done, and I think we've just left it about a year too late. I think I worry.
Yeah. I see it's 8:15, and sorry. I do want to let people in the audience ask questions as well. If people want to open up their screens and just ask questions, or Steve, I can't see people's.
So unmute. I may be making an assumption. I've been sitting back, not having to ask questions or do interviewing, and we've just had a really enjoyable session where I've learned loads. And it may well be that an awful lot of people aren't so much. I think it's really sort of in a state of digestion rather than questions. And I can see a couple of faces. Does anyone want to have a question, ask a question, or are we just deep in on thought on what's been a very interesting session with? Oh, Ben.
So not a question, but it might give time for people to think of one. But I just think that something that Hefin mentioned is really important to actually dwell upon, and it's not strictly speaking related to PR, but I do think it's important for the vibrancy of our democracy and the effectiveness of our governance structures, and that is the fact that on a local level, and forgive me, Hefin, if I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think my understanding is that all parties in Wales ahead of the local elections next week found it very difficult this time around to find people willing to stand to actually put themselves forward for election.
Right.
And it is, the case for quite a long time in Wales that, independent councillors have remained a force that perhaps in some parts of England they vanished, and it's, strictly party politics. But even for the independent groups, locally and in Carmarthenshire, also found great difficulty actually finding people willing to stand. Now, there are various reasons, clearly, but one of the things that do come across quite consistently is the fact that people find as though that the abuse level and the hassle that politicians have to put up with is simply not worth it. When you get down to the community level, and I'm a big fan actually of community councils and town councils. I think they're an underutilised section of our kind of governance in Wales. I think in England you also have parish councils and that sort of thing. But community councils, town councils of Wales still have really important competencies over day-to-day lives. And yet there are, I think in Ceredigion, the county that I represent, there are a handful of community councils that just will not fill its quota of members, let alone having an election. They just cannot fill the spaces that they have now, and that's worrying because if you follow rugby or football, grassroots, and it's often, but not always the case, through these structures that you then have candidates and politicians for the Westminster Parliament or the Senedd in Cardiff, and it's worrying. It's something that, as I say, not strictly speaking and related to PR, but it does have to do with the vibrancy of our democracy.
I mean, the question would be whether PR would improve that, a more proportional system. I mean, one of the big reasons why people don't vote is because they don't think their vote matters.
The irony is in a local election with a low turnout and small wards, your vote matters more than has more power than any vote anywhere else in any other election. You could turn an election with a couple of votes.
Right.
Ceredigion has 38 councillors now. There's been a change, so it's gone down from 42 to 38, and I think 4 of which were elected and opposed, but all the others are contested. Now we have 4 multi-member wards, but of the others, all but one are head-to-head races.
Yeah, that's not good. Although I am backing Simon Warburton. I don't know if you know Simon Warburton.
Yes.
Tell him I'm backing him, right? He's against the Lib Dem there. I'm backing him. We've got that on the record. I'm backing a Plaid Cymru member there.
I notice Peter Davidson there is always a person who like to ask questions. Do you have something you want to say, Peter?
Not really. Obviously,
Okay.
I'm just literally observing, and
Okay.
I am interested. I was interested in the comment made by David, by Hefin. I don't know which way around to say it, but
Hefin, yeah.
But I was interested in that comment regarding the way forward about a constitutional convention, because that chimes exactly with what my thinking. That based on the polling now, the most likely outcome for the next general election, whenever it happens, is a balanced parliament with Labour as the single largest party. And depending on the makeup of that parliament, that opens the door for a constitutional convention, which I believe is the most credible mechanism that we could have for introducing proportional representation alongside a raft of other key constitutional reforms.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Peter. Absolutely.
So, for example, the idea of Britain, the United Kingdom going federal, replete with a proper constitution, etc., etc. So in other words, profound constitutional reform, because that's what Britain needs. Electoral reform is an integral element of that, yes, but it does need that profound constitutional reform.
I absolutely agree, and I think if you're going to get away from the problem that Ben identified about the manifesto issue, then a post-election coalition a Rainbow Coalition, excluding the Tories, that has that convention might be the way forward to do it. It would mean a few parties putting aside some of their key issues, mind, you know, and finding that agreement. I don't see why you couldn't do it.
You mean compromise?
Yeah.
that terrible word, compromise.
Let me just come back to Ron Davies again. You know, what he did, the Welsh Labour Party, the Welsh Executive Committee of the Labour Party, is the NEC of the Wales Labour Party, wanted in 1997 or 1996, before the election, to have a first past the post system for the National Assembly election, the first National Assembly election. Now that would have alienated Ben's party, Plaid Cymru. It would have alienated the Liberal Democrats, and you wouldn't. We got the majority. We got the Senedd through the referendum by a couple of thousand votes. Literally a couple of thousand votes. It was the final vote in Pembrokeshire that got us through. We wouldn't have won that referendum if we'd gone on first past the post. It was the skill, the incredible skill of Ron Davies that took us through. And what worries me is there isn't anyone there with that skill who wants to do that job. You know, I'd love to do it. Ben would love to do it, but there isn't anyone there in the cabinet, shadow cabinet, or in the higher echelons of the SNP who seem to want to take that role on.
Right. Ben, do you hear your hand up?
Yeah, just very briefly, sorry if I may.
No, Ben, speak. You're a guest here. Speak.
Yeah, I completely agree with Hefin and also Peter, in the sense that should there be, you know, as you said, that sort of parliamentary arithmetic meant that there was a coalition of a number of parties after the next general election, I think it would be a golden opportunity. Yes, to settle PR or electoral reform rather, and I would think of PR of some form, but also other constitutional questions that have been, well, it doesn't matter which side of the constitutional debate you lie on. And I don't think actually Hefin and I are that different on this point, but it nevertheless has sapped a lot of the political energy, certainly in Westminster, perhaps to some extent in Holyrood as well, for the best part of a decade. And I fear that unless it is addressed in a comprehensive manner, it's going to continue to just sap a little bit at the parliamentary time, parliamentary energy, which is actually to nobody's benefit, and it's to all of our detriment. And you mentioned federal. If you could push it to confederal, I'd be with you 100%. But
no, I get a lot of abuse, Ben, on Twitter, because I mentioned, I'm not in favour of the purest form of Welsh independence. I would like to see it possibly a confederal system, but a confederal system that breaks England up into different regions as well. So you've got regional assemblies in England that have some devolved power. I think some of the purest Welsh nationalists don't like that because it suggests Wales might be some kind of region. That's not what I'm saying. But I do feel that a system of confederality would have those regions of England represented by proper parliaments. I think that kind of system is something you could still do without, what I say to everyone is we need to achieve this without a referendum, because the minute you go down the referendum route, you are going to get, divisions, it's just going to be horrendous. What we need to, if we're going to achieve this, we've got to do it in a constitutional convention type way.
But also on a referendum, some countries can manage them. Ireland managed it, that had this. Some countries that don't have,
But we're scarred by Brexit, though, aren't we, Nabila? We're scarred.
Where are my scars? I am scarred. I hide them.
Can we go back to this? And it's all in the hands of Gordon. On the hands of Gordon Brown.
I had one thing, Alan.
Okay, Nabila.
On Confed, well, we have one of the things is you're aware from talking from Wales, and we're thinking on PR for the UK, in terms of England, which is the area where it's lacking. But there is a wider issue of how Westminster centric things are, and even with the devolution, they were reflecting that, and now, you have that, and they're still in terms of Westminster. Is it giving the return that under this system? Why do you think it will be different in Confed?
It will make a difference, because if you're going to have a confederal system, you will have to have a written constitution. And from having a codified constitution, you are more likely to have a very consistent system. So you won't have the asymmetric sort of quasi-federalism that you have at the moment, with different types of devolution in different countries or parts of the UK. One thing that does lead to is confusion, and if confusion, whether we like it or not, it would be far better if people all realise, well, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and then regions of some form of England have certain competencies, and then you have a confederal parliament or assembly, or whatever you want to call it, that have the reserved probably defence, some aspects of taxation, trade, you name it, right? Now, it would be a lot better in terms of selling it as a valued sort of offer. I always look back to the experiences of 2002, 2003 with the regional devolved assemblies for the north of England. And I think there were a few mistakes there made, but one of them is that it was something that's just for the north. Just for some areas. If it was something that was across, that everybody in England was going to have something of the same sort, I think you would have had a lot more buy-in, because then you'd have a situation where somebody in, say, Yorkshire would say, well, I don't want Lancashire to have one, and that's for us not to have one. And likewise, you'd have some of the home counties thinking, well, if London has one, we've got a chance for something similar now. You have that dynamic of everybody having a fair crack at the whip. Sorry, I know Hefin wants to probably come in about this.
I agree with you. I think
I was just going to suggest that we maybe call to an end the formal part. A few people who want to still keep gabbing, and we can even speak, we'll just sort of stop the video. So I wanted to thank Ben Lake and to Hefin and earlier to Laura for being in this discussion with Wales. It's been jumping around, but I think we made some very good points, and thanks a lot.